I thought we'd break the ice, not that way, but a different way, by asking each of our panelists to talk about briefly their favorite 2SLGBTQ plus challenged or banned book. So why don't we start with Lisa? What would you, you have a big choice because a significant number of the books that are challenged are 2SLGBTQ plus books.
Thanks, Jim. So my favorite title is Melissa. It is on display outside or just on the other side of this wall, and TPL has over 60 copies available. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, it is a very quick read. A couple of reasons why it is my favorite book. One, it was originally published as George, and the author, soon after it's being published, decided to change the title to be more respectful to the main character. So as a cataloger, that is very near and dear to my heart. The other reason is because of all my work in intellectual freedom, it is a book that I have worked extensively to keep in library collections because it was the 5th most challenged title for over 10 years between 2000 and 2010. The book challenges cisnormative roles, promotes allyship, and separates something that I think is really important, the ideas of sexuality and gender expression, and does it in a way that's very understandable for young readers. So again, Melissa is my favorite one.
Thank you.
Nice.
Shauna.
Yeah, I had to do some research when I saw this question. We live in a little bubble at my school where it's all very queer and trans positive, and the parents and guardians are also queer and trans positive. So I'm not really aware of books that have been challenged that much, but so I was looking it up and I saw that this isn't explicitly a 2SLGBTQ plus book, but The Marrow Thieves by Shay is a young adult fiction that has themes of colonialism, kind of speaks to residential schools in Canada, and yeah, just the effects of colonialism. And there is a very important queer character in that book, and it's been challenged because of the themes of colonialism, but I just thought that was kind of interesting considering that transphobia and homophobia, these things emerge from colonialism in Canada. So yeah, it's interesting.
So what's the name of the book again?
It's called The Marrow Thieves.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a science fiction book. Yeah.
Regan.
I'm going to say one of the last ones that I read, or reread, I guess, which is We Have Always Been Here. Mm-hmm. So it is a memoir, and the reason I like it is because it speaks so eloquently about how intersections of our identities kind of play a part in all of that, all of the parts of our lives, that you can't really separate those threads. So that's my pick.
Thank you. And Dylan, what's your favorite?
My favorite is a book called Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars by Kai Cheng Tom, who I think is in Toronto, a local writer. You could, I guess the short version is it's about basically a group of trans girls who beat up straight people, which we already endorse. And I love this book because I feel like it's just so virtuosic in terms of being really funny, incredibly poetic. I think seeing that combination alone is already pretty rare. And it's like very grandiose. And I feel like in the wrong hands, the book could almost be cheesy, but it's just so like Kai Cheng Tom is such a good writer that it's just such a wonderful read. And I feel like you just get totally absorbed into this world that's, I would say, so maximalist in a way. And yeah, it's been my obsession for a couple years since I read it. So I'm always recommending this book.
Well, thank you. Matt stole what I was going to make a bridge now to what's been happening more generally. And I'm going to repeat a couple of things he said because it's worth noting. The ALA 2 weeks ago, the American Library Association, every year in March announces the most challenged books in America for the previous year. And they're going to announce the actual titles, I think, in a few days. But there was a 65% increase in the number of challenges last year over 2022. A huge surge. Censorship is getting very popular. And the LGBTQ plus and BIPOC books made up about half of all the challenges. And 5 of the 6 most challenged books were 2SLGBTQ plus positive books. Now in Canada, we're actually putting together for the first time a really comprehensive database of challenges, which is available on the Center for Free Expression's website. So we decided to make it a public one, so anyone in the public can go in and see what books are being challenged and how they're being dealt with. The most single challenged event or publication was not actually a publication, was an event, were drag story times in libraries across the country. They were challenged, there were about 50 challenges to them. In one case, or actually in two cases, the protesters who would turn out, and these weren't challenges filled out by somebody writing a little form, these were turning up by people turning out of the library and shouting at people going into the events. And in two cases, in Coquitlam and in Calgary, the protesters, the homophobes, were really organized, and they would send people into the library to engage the librarians on duty in conversation, so others in their group could charge into the room where the drag story time was taking place and start yelling homophobic epithets at the performers and at the parents and at the kids. And in both cases, the cops were called and they were arrested. But it's very aggressive forms of challenging that we're seeing increasingly. But this isn't new. I mean, Regan, could you talk a little bit about the historical context for challenges to books in North America?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to go back a ways to remember that, like, a lot of this comes down to what was, allowed to be in shops, what was allowed to be in libraries. Our organization, the Archives, exists because there was not LGBTQ2+ material in public libraries that community needed to find its own space to put their books because it wasn't going to be found here. So, organizations like ours, the creation of Glad Day, the creation of Little Sisters, all of these bookstores became like a hub. This is where you could find the information because you weren't going to find it anywhere else. But, the government took a really active role in making sure that books could not get to those bookstores. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at, I put down numbers because I'm not good at numbers, so I wrote them down. So between 1985 and 1991, Glad Day Bookstore had 400 to 500 seizures at the border of books trying to get into Canada. So, not only was it, the books were getting seized, like you couldn't even get them here. They couldn't even get challenged. Staff at Glad Day Bookstore have been arrested for criminal obscenity. There's been more than 3 arrests. And that dates into the 90s. Like, we're not talking about like this just happened in the 70s. We're talking about 1990s. If we're talking about Little Sisters, the Supreme Court case was only finalized in 2000. So we're not talking about ancient history here. We're talking about the very recent past. In 1986, and this is where I think it's notable, 500 books and magazines that were destined for Little Sisters were stopped at the border. And that's because the Border Control had a list of booksellers that sold LGBTQ2+ material. They specifically looked for it. They opened up those boxes, they rifled through it, they damaged books, and in some cases they just seized them. And they even seized books that could be found in the Vancouver Public Library. Like, they were grabbing Bollier and like being like, no, this isn't going through. So I think one of the main things that we have to remember is that this is recent that we're talking about having queer and trans material in public spaces, that people can actually find it here in a public space, that they don't have to figure out like where Gerald Moldenhauer lives in 1970 and buy books out of his living room because that was the only spot to buy them in Toronto in the 1970s. We've come to a point where we can find the material here, but it's not like it's a situation where we have a long history of these books being available to people and widely available to people. Last thing I'll mention is that these police raids and that have a huge impact on communities. So the Body Politic was raided for their publications in December of 1977 or morning of 78. I'm really bad at numbers and remembering dates. And so, when police are coming in and grabbing material and seizing boxes and boxes full of material, people who subscribe to LGBTQ2+ material, you don't feel safe trying to access that material. There is a level of discomfort because you are being surveilled. And so, that is within our lifetimes for many of us. And, we really need to keep that history in mind of the importance of those bookstores and the importance of those court cases and seizures in mind while we're having these conversations, because really the work that was done by those booksellers, by the community organizing to make sure that those censorship and obscenity laws weren't impacting what was actually accessible to Canadians. I think we need to really keep all of that in mind when we're talking about what's available today in libraries.
And I think your point about this isn't just the distant past. I mean, the Little Sisters case before the Supreme Court was about 22 decades ago, and we lost it largely. I mean, the Little Sisters bookstore was challenging the constitutionality of the Canadian customs officers being able to block things and requiring the bookstore to justify the material. In other words, the only victory in this case was that the practice was allowed to continue, but the onus was put on the customs officer to justify the exclusion rather than putting out the bookstore. But by and large, even that recently, the court decision wasn't favorable to us.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that this is government defining what is and was not acceptable material, right? So you've got the memorandum, and I always have to write it down. So it's D911, which was a 10-point list of obscenity indicators. So when they were going through the boxes, they had this government list that said what is and what is not acceptable for community to access. And that's the reality of bringing material into Canada. And it's not like you can necessarily always get things published in Canada. Sometimes it has to be in the States. And if it is, getting it over the border, that's never a guarantee.
And we're going to talk a little later about folks who want to take us back to that era, who are alive and well in this country, unfortunately. So we've been talking a little bit or a lot about what's going on in the United States. Lisa, can you compare a little bit what the TPL has been experiencing, what you see happening in Canada vis-a-vis what's happening in the U.S.?
So while American public libraries have seen a 92% increase in challenges last year, at TPL, our challenges have remained the same at just under 10. Our collections challenges remain under 5, and our other challenges include event space rentals and some programs. Jim mentioned story time protests for drag queens, and that has definitely been on the increase. But relative to the population that we serve, Toronto is fortunate in that our challenges do remain low. I think partially it is because of our material selection policy, our program policies, our room rental, art exhibit policies that all have included in them a request for reconsideration process that customers can actually go through to formally request a reconsideration. We're quite transparent on how we make decisions, why we make decisions, why we select certain things, and why we offer programs. But it is not without notice that we see what's happening in America, and we are working closely, again, too, with the Center for Free Expression to proactively prepare for increasing challenges, yet we have not seen them at Toronto Public Library, but that's definitely not the case for other Canadian public libraries, because there's libraries on the East Coast and West Coast who have seen thousands of coordinated challenges coming to their doorsteps, and then them having to organize and prepare and respond to all those challenges too. So while at TPL we remain fortunate in not seeing the large number quite yet, we do know that it's happening in Canada.
Yes, you're quite right about the variability across the country. We're going to be talking in a minute about some of the groups that are really pushing this. There's one in New Brunswick called the Miramichi Freedom Warriors. who got in New Brunswick, they have a provincial library system. So they're all an arm of the provincial government. So there are libraries in different towns, but they're all branch of one system. And this group got a copy of the request for reconsideration form that the library uses, made thousands of photocopies of it, and distributed in fundamentalist Christian churches across the province, encouraging the folks to file complaints or challenges. And New Brunswick libraries had more challenges in 3 months last year than in the entire history of public libraries in the province. So there's this enormous variability of response and quite worrying. Now, one of the things is how all these challenges are having impacts on people in different groups. I mean, Dylan, what effect do these kinds of challenges and what you hear about in libraries, what effect do you think that has on you and other writers?
It's something that's hard to say exactly. So, because it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I think a lot of times for people who are in a marginalized group, the discrimination that you face is not always super black and white. Which is kind of maddening in its own way, because it's like, well, am I imagining this? Am I not? Am I like playing whether it be race card or we don't really have a phrase with like the queer card. Like, am I playing that card, or is there something weird going on here? So I think I can talk a bit about what work I've done and then where I'm kind of at now. And then you'll be left like me to deduce in your own, within this context, what that might or might not mean. Certainly it doesn't feel very good for me right now in the industry, but I'll do what I just said I'll do. So I'll talk a bit about, the context of me. So I have 2 books out, like one that I'm the writer illustrator of. That's called Rainboy. That's with Chronicle Books, which is a publisher in the States. Frankly, it's one of the bigger picture book publishers for kids' books. I did that book. That book honestly had pretty good reviews. I had like 2-star reviews. I had really good reviews about my artwork. Then I had that was in 2020, April 2020 that came out. A couple months later, the book that I did just the illustrations for came out, called Be Amazing. That one is, the author is this drag kid named Desmond is Amazing. That's like their drag name. They have like a huge Instagram following for being like a cute little drag kid. That kid has been surrounded in tons and tons of controversy. There's like huge right-wing like campaigns against this kid. Unfortunately, obviously, these campaigns revolve around terms like grooming and that kind of thing. I know people who know that kid, and they really feel their mom is super, super supportive, and they do not feel like this child is being abused. But there's a lot of stuff online. Like, if you start looking up Desmond is Amazing, that's like its own YouTube subcategory of content, unfortunately. So all to say that the books that I have published are both very queer and queer coded. My book that I authored and everything, Rainboy, on Goodreads, I don't spend much time, I promise, looking at the Goodreads comments, but I have read them, and I can tell that some of the low ratings I get and stuff, it's like I click through and it's like they're self-identifying Christian moms. So like I said, I'll let you deduce, as I'm doing, what the implications of that might kind of be. Now cut to now. Now, even though my first 2 books had, I got really good reviews for my artwork and stuff, I haven't worked in the industry again since. I have my, what we call in the business, my dummy. So I have my rough copy of my next book, which is called Bodies of Water, ready. It's been finished for a year. I've had a really bad time with trying to get the book published. I had an agent, and the agent was so enthusiastic about my work and and saying things like this will be a book, and then all of a sudden I can't get a hold of them anymore, and then eventually I do get a hold of them and I got dropped. Then I got a book deal with my editor for my first book. Then we were trying to find an agent. That just went on forever. Then an agent said that they are going to represent the book. Then they basically ghosted me. Then I found another agent. That agent was definitely not a good fit, like was very disrespectful about me and my work. Then me and that agent started working together. And then when the publisher found out that that agent wasn't representing the book anymore, all of a sudden my my book deal was dropped after having been in negotiations for months. They tried to say that it was because I had proposed in the negotiation a limit on, I proposed a structure about how many revisions there would be on at each step. And they were just like, okay, absolutely not. Your book deal is done, which I found very suspicious because we're in negotiation. They could have just been like, no, we can't. I could have been like, okay, well then we can still move forward, but it was terminated. So I'm not feeling very good about the industry right now for me and my place in it. And it's very demoralizing because when I started in the industry, I thought, I really because I'm not from that industry. Like I have a background in animation. I worked in editorial illustration. And then I was in kids books. It made sense with my skill set. And then, I don't know. It's just like slowly really soured. And that's kind of where I'm at now. Like I have this book that I'm ready to publish, but after a year of trying to get it published, I feel so reluctant about even putting it back into the world. And I'm taking a bit of a break from emailing it out right now, the rough version, because it's been kind of debilitating what the book has gone through the past year. So I'm thinking, I have another project that I'm working on, so with animation, so I'm thinking I'll work on that, and then hopefully in a while I'll feel like I can come back to the book with a bit of energy and, I don't know, something like that.
Well, one of the consequences of the aggressive demands for bans and challenges for books, there's the direct effect on writers, which for the most part can be resisted, but the effects on the publishers and on the agents is, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's too infrequently talked about, because they just it's going to be controversial, we don't need that. And we've had reports too in bookstores that are reluctant to carry certain things for similar reasons. So while public libraries have been very good about resisting these pressures, the side effects of all this are quite serious, I think. Thank you for sharing.
And they're never going to admit something like that. They're going to just, like when I had my letter of offer for Bodies of Water, the editor is saying things like, I love the book, I love that it could be read like this, because there's a very obvious, the book is basically about this character that transforms through different forms of bodies of water. So they start as a puddle, and then they become like a stream, a lake, bigger and bigger bodies of water, and then in the end they become land. So there's this metaphorical reading that's very easy to see of transness and this change of expression. So in the letter, the editor is like, oh my God, I love that there's this this trans potential reading, but also it's universal, blah, blah. And then it's cut to 6 months later, it's you're dropped all of a sudden. It's okay, if you cared so much about this story and you thought it's so important, then it's just dropped in 1 second. It's just, I don't know. It feels like if you value this so much, then why aren't you acting like it when it's time to sign the contract? Why do I feel so disposable if it was so valuable a second ago when it was about gay rights, broadly speaking?
Right, and the same problems with actors. There's just a number of reasons why you say, well, you just didn't make it for this casting or whatever, and it's nebulous. And you know what's happening, but it can all be denied.
Yeah, and it's known that the picture book industry right now is not doing well economically. Everyone I know in the industry is oh my God, there's no money there. One of the agents I was working with at some point was there's more money in picture books last year than there is this year. But they're not going to admit that either. It's going to be well, you asked for this, and you're such a diva, and there's no, it's all on you. There's such a lack of transparency, and it's something that goes across industries, but it's definitely there in my experience in picture books.
So Sean, I wanted to ask you about what you're seeing in schools. Now, you're in a very special school. You might describe what that is, but what do you hear from colleagues in other schools, and what is the impact of all of this on both on the education system and then perhaps on the kids?
Yes, well, the school I work at is a small alternative school for 2SLGBTQ plus teens, so it's grade 9 to 12. We have about 30 students, and like I said, like we are like a little oasis of kind of safety for trans students. All of our students are trans and gender nonconforming, but they feel the effects of these things. This is part of a larger cultural context or conversation where people are, kind of like getting very upset about the gender question or learning, the gender ideology, and they feel the effects of that. So we haven't had anything happen at our school yet, but I do have a friend and a colleague who works at Victoria Park Collegiate, which is a high school in Scarborough. And there was a protest there earlier this school year, I think in September, October. And it was it was called part of the 1 million march or something like
Action
this.
for Canada, which the group will talk about, organized this 1 million person march where
Yeah.
they're going to be on a certain day. There were going to be marches against LGBTQ and sex ed books in libraries and in schools.
Yeah, so there was like this huge protest planned. My friend found out about it, and then it became kind of incumbent on her as like a queer teacher in the school to organize a counter protest, which was interesting that the admin didn't pick that up and figure it out. It was her who kind of led that. And so there was a counter protest. Students are fighting about this within the school because students are on different sides of that fence. And it all seemed quite stressful. At our school, we are waiting for something to happen. We're a small school. We fly under the radar, but anyone who could Google, gay high school, and immediately they would find us. So me and my colleague, my co-teacher, Brody, who's here. Hey, Brody. We've been working hard last year and this year to push our admin to get a lockdown procedure. Generally, lockdown procedures in high schools are like very general. They're the same for all high schools, but we're in the basement of the Metropolitan Community Church. So we don't have like a principal that's going to come on the intercom and tell us what to do. We're kind of missing that step. So, and because, schools have been, like many services, so underfunded by the provincial government in recent years, our admin is very stretched thin. And so we have had to press them to make this a priority, right? We don't want our students to show up to school to a protest or something like this. So, yeah, but the students are asking me, they've been asking us, like, do we have a lockdown procedure? What do we do if something happens? And we have had actually a couple incidents, not like a protest, but last year we got a hate email from someone who just said, fuck all your flags. Okay. Oh yeah, and the subject heading was hello. And then you open it, says that. And then earlier this year, a couple students were sitting outside on the steps and they were approached by two men who threatened them with a knife and then continued on to go to the other side of the school where other students were sitting and were yelling homophobic and transphobic slurs at them. So there have been a couple like smaller incidents. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've been, what I've been observing is that while public libraries have been really solid in resisting, these school boards have been quite variable. A lot of school boards don't know what to do. A principal gets a parent calling and say, what the hell do you have these books in the school library or in the curriculum material? And the principal freaks out. Have you been hearing anything like that happening?
Yeah.
Not so much in Toronto, I don't know, but
yeah,
across
no,
the country.
Definitely in Toronto. At our school, we work with two social workers who are part of, I think they've rebranded the name, but it used to be called the Gender and Sexual Violence Prevention Team, Gender Identity, Gender-Based Violence, Sexual something. Anyways, they work for the whole board and they get calls on the regular from principals with this very situation saying, oh, you're teaching about gender, you're teaching about sexual identity or sexuality. I don't want my kids learning this. And so the principals are calling them saying like, what do I say? And it's very frustrating for them, I think, because they're thinking like, what do you mean? What do you say? It's public school. Like we teach like we teach like the earth is not flat. You know what I mean? The earth is round. Like we're just teaching facts in public school. And if you don't want your kids to be exposed to this, then you need to figure out a different kind of schooling. Of course, a principal's not going to say that because funding relies on how many students you have, right? But they don't know how to stand on those principles. Some of them who are calling, and they also don't know that talking about these things isn't the same as sexualizing children, right? They think it's like something in them feels like maybe it is wrong, or maybe it is, they feel unsure about it. And so there is like a big education piece that needs to be done for our administration.
Well, the group I keep mentioning, Action for Canada, which started out as an anti-masking, anti-vaxxer group in Vancouver, and now claims 99 chapters across the country, and in 2021-22 raised $800,000 to further its work, it began by taking exception to 62 curriculum materials, 62 books that were part of the British Columbia Department of Education curriculum on sexual orientation and gender identity, resources that teachers could use in teaching courses of that sort. So they started issuing notices of liability, which they would send to principals, to CEOs of public libraries, saying, if you have any one of these 62 books in your collection, you're violating the criminal code provisions on child pornography, and you can and will be charged. So, playing on that fear that you're describing, it's all pure bullshit. They actually either are lying or haven't read the provision on child pornography, because while it is very vaguely written, it has a section further along, they just don't read the paragraph 6, which says none of these charges can be laid for any material that's there for scientific research or educational purpose. So there's a clear carve out, so everybody's absolutely secure. But they prey on that, and lots of people get really frightened by this misinformation. And it's a very aggressive campaign. Although they're based in BC, school principals and CEOs of public libraries across the country have been getting these and trying to figure out what to do about this. And there's a real effort to return to that bad period 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I think it goes back to a little bit of what Regan was saying too. First, the materials were being blocked at the border. Now that has been overcome and the materials are available in our libraries and in other public spaces, it's important to remember that we have the Canadian Charter. In Ontario, we have the Ontario Human Rights Code. We all have responsibilities. We all should have material selection policies or criteria for how we include resources for people to choose to read and self-select, and equally not limit others' opportunities to choose and self-select. And that's where these lists come in, where people are saying, en masse, these 60-something books need to go. It's unfortunate they came across the border, so now we're going to attack the individual institutions in making those decisions. And I think it's hard sometimes for the individuals at those institutions, if they don't have an intellectual freedom statement, if they don't have a material selection policy, if they don't have the procedures or guidelines for how to look at those requests for reconsideration, how do they respond to that? Because the material is in Canada and it is in publicly funded spaces, and they need to be given, people need to have the choice to select. Regan?
Yeah, and I want to say that when we talk to teachers, because we recently created education resources for teachers to use in their curriculum, so using primary source material to really, you're not going to find this in your history book. Here are the primary source materials. You can teach about it in your classroom. And when we talk to teachers, they actually asked for scripts. So we created like an advocacy guide. So here is what you can do, and here is how you can talk about it with your school board or your principal, because they were asking, what do we do? What do we say? And if they are not of community, if they are like not familiar with how that plays in, they just really want to support their students, you know, they're going to need support. And, you know, we hope that, you know, policies like that exist, that we can point to them and say, look, this is what other folks are doing. Here's how you can talk about it and how you can stand up for the students that you teach.
What you're describing is the importance of organizations within the LGBTQ community historically. I mean, you might talk just a little more about the role that bookstores play. I mean, you talked about Glad Day and Little Sisters, and now in some ways your organization is continuing that vital role of reaching beyond and both providing support and information.
Yeah, and it's really, you know, our organization came a lot out of the body politic, which has a long history of censorship, and I'm sure many people already know about that and the raids that took place. But you know, the body politic was a place where people could read about what was going on, where they could go to for like reviews of books. Like, how are you going to find out what new book is out if it's like not allowed in the bookstore? You know, at least you could read a review about it and maybe you could try to find it somewhere. And so, you know, the publications that were happening, the newsletters, the body politic, you know, it was all trying to make this information available to communities. And, you know, that's really where libraries and archives and museums, you know, our organization, like I said, exists because nobody else was collecting that. And I don't just mean library books, but like personal papers, artifacts, artwork. So, you know, community had to become its own library space. We had to become non-circulating because books walked out the door. But, you know, community creates its own space when they can't find it elsewhere and wait for everybody else to catch up. And so I think that's just another example of like, we haven't outlived our purpose yet as an archive, as a library, as a museum, because there still is so much uncertainty and so much like protests going on around material being in these kind of spaces. So, you know, for us to have a space that, you know, is going to be run by LGBTQ+ folks, you know, the board is queer and trans, and community members are voting members. You know, we're trying to make sure that the community controls that vision and that activity. So I think there's still a place for community to have their own space, as well as for books to be available in library spaces like this.
Lisa, can you share a little bit about the growing number of forms of challenges that we're facing in libraries? I mean, it used to be just people would fill out a request for reconsideration form because they objected to something in the collection, but you had a very dramatic case. I mean, you had cases of challenges over room rentals, and I mean, now a significant percentage of the challenges, in fact, are not about things in the collection. Are you seeing some of that here? I mean, across the country we are. I don't
Yes,
know.
yeah. No, and we see it at Toronto Public Library too. Just last night at our board meeting, we presented our 2023 annual challenges report. And while 3 of the materials presented were from our collection, the other 4 challenges were not related to the collection and for other services the library provides. The library is committed to being a vital ingredient in our community to defend and promote democracy, and that is why we do what we do. We have an equity statement and an intellectual freedom statement, which are mutually reinforcing, and you can't have one without the other.
That's right.
And so when you think about art exhibits, room rentals, and other programs that we offer, there are opportunities for our customers to go through the request for reconsideration process if they'd like to have something reviewed that the library is offering. And as people on the panel have said too, there are opportunities for customers in a democratic society that we have the privilege of living in to protest as well. And TPL has seen an increase in both of those, as you alluded to, Jim, and as you've said, is happening across the country too. As I already said, again, for the population that we serve, TPL does see a very low number of those, but they are increasing. And in general, in our community, they're increasing too, not always related to the work of the public library, but just in general around the topics that the panel's talking about today.
Could you just talk a little bit about the campaign? The Toronto Public Library has a campaign on intellectual freedom. It's sort of a model for the whole country.
Yeah, so it's part of what this program is, a part of that series. It's about what's at stake. There's a great advertising or an awareness campaign in our subways, on billboards, talking about what's at stake. Information isn't a privilege. The best ideas are free. Freedom to read them. We're really privileged too to be part of the annual Pride Parade in Toronto. Last year's theme was intellectual freedom, and we look forward to promoting that same topic again this year. And I think just the leadership that TPL has been able to take through all of the divisions working together, not just the collections division or the programming division or the communications teams, promoting intellectual freedom again as a core value and in all the work that we do, helps promote the library's capacity to provide collections and services, but also to have those important conversations, because everyone is allowed to, again, believe whatever they would like to believe and access the resources and services they'd like, but the library is committed to providing a breadth of services and collections for people. And again, that's the democratic part of intellectual freedom and what we're talking about today.
With the growth of opposite challenges and so forth, and as I say, taking aggressive forms, protests, there have been dozens and dozens of protests outside of libraries because of sex ed books or LGBTQ positive books. There have been petitions. People have been starting across the country, change.org petitions, demanding that certain books be gotten out of the library. The Winnipeg Public Library has been a real target for those, with thousands of people signing petitions. You have to get rid of this sex ed book or this LGBTQ book. And then the more violent actually going in and trying to disrupt events. How do any of you see this relating to what's going on more generally in Canadian culture and society at the moment? I mean, we're at a very polarized time, and with social media facilitating a great diversity of views and sort of no curation or censorship. And in fact, the platforms accelerating this because they feed people what they will, they get most reaction either by feeding you what you already think or feeding you things that you get upset about because you stay on the platform more because you're outraged and because you're contemplative. Do you see a relationship between what you're experiencing in the various aspects of where you work with this broader challenges we're having in our society?
Yeah. This made me think about a movie that I came across recently, and maybe some of you have seen it, and I showed it to my students in history class. It's called El Macombo, Everything the Nazis Hate, and it documents persecution and singling out of queer and trans people at the start of the rise of Nazi Germany. And it's quite interesting because when you watch the movie, everything feels very familiar in terms of the polarization, in terms of the fear mongering. I personally don't believe that people like our Minister of Education, Stephen Lecce, or Pierre Poilievre necessarily believe that gender ideology is, as they call it, gender ideology is harming children. But I know that, I think that they are smart and using this upswell of anger and fear to build up their bases, right? And also to distract from other things that are much more pressing for our society. And when we were invited to this panel, I thought about that movie as well because, the banning of books at that time, there was Magnus Hirschfeld, who was like a sexologist and a doctor, I think, who was like at the forefront of treating trans people, like providing healthcare to trans women, especially. And he had started the Institute of Sexology. He had all of his research there. There were books there. And the Nazi Youth Party raided the Institute, and they took all his books and research out into like the square and burned them, right? So like, I just thought that was, because you hear about book burning, or you have this idea that that's happened before, but I didn't really know what the actual context was. And like learning about that with my students, and then like hearing about these kinds of things now, it all just feels very familiar.
Because Shauna mentioned a movie, I'll mention a movie too. Just last week, I saw Queen Tut, which is a movie about Toronto and queer people losing spaces because of gentrification, and some of the stuff that Reagan's talked about, bookstores and other spaces that needed to exist because the community needs a space. And while the libraries are a space for everyone, queer, trans, 2SLGBTQ people sometimes need their own spaces to just have spaces, whether it's for safety or for just for gathering. And it's interesting to know that this movie is about stuff, that gentrification that happened in the 70s in Toronto, but and it continues, but how impactful it has been to the 2SLGBTQ community to be losing those spaces. And it's not just spaces for people. As Reagan has said, it was also spaces for collections. And Toronto Public Library has just started the book sanctuary that Matt mentioned, and includes many 2SLGBTQ books. And all of the 100 branches of the library are sanctuaries for collections. But I think ongoing, Jim, as you talk about the larger things that are happening specifically in Toronto, those spaces are so important. And so when we talk about the archives or the Triangle program, just those physical spaces too are so important for people to be able to access services and resources too. Reagan, you have your mic up.
Yeah, and for us to have the collection, and our collection has become the world's second largest LGBTQ2+ collection in the world, the largest independent one. Our operating fund is entirely driven by LGBTQ2+ community members who make sure that we still exist. We're paying Toronto rent on a library of 26,000 titles. We're paying rent on, 10,000 boxes of, personal papers and history here. And the reality is we're out of space. We have 3 locations where we store our material because there's no space left. And where do we find space? We need a new building. But how are we, as an organization that is completely funded by the queer community and the trans community, supposed to find enough space? And in Toronto, when, the developments that are going around our building are interrupting our lives every day, as it interrupts everybody here. Personally, I've been rent evicted twice in the last 3 years. I've had to move further and further outside of Toronto just to stay here and work with this organization. And so, we've seen so many of our volunteers and staff members have to leave Toronto. They just can't afford to live here anymore. And so we're losing part of the community. We're losing, the Church Wellesley area is not the same as it was, obviously, but we're losing that opportunity to have community space in Toronto. And even though spaces exist, it's still, they're closing. And, during the pandemic, our exhibition space actually just filled with boxes from organizations that were closing, that had closed their doors. So, I think even though we've got all these places closing, all these people leaving, we've got our history and collections kind of on the line as gentrification kind of forces community away and forces them away from their own history.
In the little bit of time before we turn to the audience, what worries me a lot is the the extent I see across the country of the challenges, especially, I mean, this focus on LGBTQ. It's also a focus on sex ed, but they tend not to, they see sex ed books are going to lead, and they talk always about the objection to the sex ed books for kids as grooming and so forth. So, I mean, I just see the breadth of that and the aggressive support of that right across the country as a really worrisome sign, and as an indication of sort of a counter revolution to the wonderful changes that have happened over the last 30 years because of a lot of organizing and hard work. So I guess I'd like to end by what can we be doing about this? I mean, you've already talked a little bit about what the TPL is doing about it in terms of its campaign around this, and you might talk a little bit more about it. What do others think we could be doing?
Yeah, I think it's that continued allyship, because remembering that sometimes the resources are the sole source of information that people have, whether it's at the archive or the library. It's windows and mirrors in our collections are the self-discovery tools that, again, in a democratic society that we have.
I think it's about making sure that the history and the collections are visible. It can be hard to find the collections, and it can be hard for people to know where to start to look. And because of that, disinformation is so easily spread. And so using like our tools that we have to make sure that the right information is getting out to the people that need it most, I think that's really where our focus is going to be in the next little while, making sure it's accessible to the communities that need it.
What thoughts do you have, Dylan, about what could be done?
I don't know. You two have spoken about it so well. I don't want to spoil your answers with just like something I'm making up just to fill the air. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Shauna.
So you're in a place where it really has to be made to happen in the schools.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is like where I think education is extremely important. Like, if people don't have the knowledge, then it is easier to be kind of swindled by this misinformation, right? In terms of like teachers, like being a teacher, thinking about that teacher who's like in a school, maybe rurally or where it's more of a conservative vibe. Again, it's really about finding your allies and people who are like-minded, and it's about knowing those principles about what is public education, right? And being able to stand on those principles, even if you don't have support from your admin team. And if you have union, like I feel like the best way for us to work against all of this organizing by the far right is to organize, right? We need to work together as much as possible. I don't really know anything else that is going to work besides that.
Well, there are a number of things that are going on. I mean, there's GLAD book ban toolkits that are, all sorts of resources like Reagan, you're making available to others. The National Coalition Against Censorship in the United States has been setting up student banned book reading clubs to bring students together and giving them books to encourage that sort of thing. I think you might describe the Sanctuary project that you have.
So libraries across America, and now libraries growing across Canada too, have created book sanctuaries. And it's that intentional practice of putting the items into your collection, and as Reagan said, making them visible for people to know these are challenged books. These are good quality books that folks can choose, if they choose to, access, read, discover. Again, it might be for discovery, it might be for allyship, it might be for windows and mirrors, whatever the reason is. It might just be a good book to read. But it's that intentional work. And again, as Regan and Shauna have said, being vulnerable and asking for help. Jim, you've mentioned some organizations that are available for help, but find your ally, ask for help, get connected to the resources that you need. None of us have all the answers, but working collaboratively, we're all committed to this work, and we're happy to support people. And there's other people out there too, whether it's a local bookstore or somebody else, that are happy to help people who are committed to doing this work as well.